Cluster B personality disorders are characterized by dramatic, overly emotional, and unpredictable thoughts and behavior. From Ars Longa Media, this is Cluster B, scientifically informed, expert insights into the 4 Cluster B personality types: antisocial, borderline, narcissistic, and histrionic personality disorder. Here's today's host, Dr. Todd Grande.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is the MMPI unbeatable? And I have a number of other related questions. What is the MMPI? What is it used for? Can I offer a critique of the instrument? And what is the fake bad scale on the MMPI? So MMPI stands for Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's a psychometric test. It's a self-report, true and false. And it's used to identify mental disorders and the severity of mental disorders, as well as personality. A brief history of the test: we see the original MMPI was published in 1943. In 1989, we see the MMPI-2, and this has 567 items. It takes about 60 to 90 minutes to complete. In 2008, we see the MMPI-2 restructured form, or RF. This has 338 items. It takes about 35 to 50 minutes to complete. We also see the MMPI-A and the MMPI-ARF. Those are for adolescents, and those are beyond the scope of this video. Now, this instrument, the MMPI, is owned by the University of Minnesota, and it's distributed by Pearson, so it's a paid instrument. Clinicians pay to administer this to clients. This instrument requires a level C qualification, and I'll talk more about that later. Now, when I use the term item, like if I say 338 items or 567 items, I'm talking about one of the statements on the instrument to which an individual responds. They either respond true or false. Some of the items seem fairly clear in terms of what they're getting at. For example, I like parties and socials, or I seldom worry about my health. Again, those two seem fairly clear. Others are a bit more subtle, like everything is going on too fast around me, or I am very awkward and clumsy. So it can take a little while to figure out what those mean. Now, the restructured form, the MMPI-2 RF, did not replace the MMPI-2. Both tests are still fairly popular, and there's actually quite a bit of controversy around the RF. Some people think it's a better test, but others aren't sure. Now, this disagreement takes place at many levels. Interestingly, with the MMPI, some of the arguments have been between authors of and contributors to various MMPI instruments. So some MMPI experts are in disagreement. We see many articles with these researchers fighting back and forth about different properties of the RF and even of the MMPI-2. Because the RF version is becoming increasingly popular and because it's technically the latest version, I'm going to be offering my critique on this instrument. So when I say MMPI, I'm mostly referring to the MMPI-2 restructured form. Let's take a look at the RF. Again, we see there's 338 true or false items. It's shorter than the MMPI-2, but still a long test overall. We see 51 scales total, divided into validity and substantive scales. So when I say the word scale, what am I referring to? So on a psychometric instrument, a scale reports the activity from specific items on the test as compared to a norm group. For example, on a test, if there are 15 items that measure depression, and somebody endorsed 14 of those items, that would probably make them more depressed than a fair percentage of the population. Perhaps that makes them more depressed than 90% of the population. Now, the items that load onto a particular scale, the ones associated with that scale, can be unique to that scale, or they can overlap with other scales. For example, depression and anxiety have a number of symptoms in common. So an item designed to measure one of those symptoms that both depression and anxiety share, that would load on both a depression scale and an anxiety scale. So on the MMPI, again, the scales can be divided into validity and substantive. Validity scales are designed to tell the clinician who performed the assessment whether the results of the test can be trusted. Substantive scales have to do with psychopathology and personality indicators. Now, looking at the validity scales, we see there are several. We see there's a scale for cannot say. So if someone's taken the test and they don't answer some of the questions, or they answer them both true and false, like if it's a paper and pencil type test, that would make the cannot say scale higher. We see variable response inconsistency, so answering similar opposite question pairs inconsistently. So if one question says that I always do something, and another question says I never do something, if you put true for always, you'd have to put false for never, or else the result would be inconsistent. We also see true response inconsistency. This is when somebody answers a lot of questions true or false. Like just in a row, they just put a bunch of true or a bunch of false, trying to beat the test. We see a lot of over-reporting scales, like infrequent responses. These are items that are rarely endorsed. When I say rarely, usually we're talking about items that are endorsed less than 10% of the time. So if somebody endorses a large number of those items that are rarely endorsed, that looks a little bit suspicious. We see infrequent psychopathology responses, so over-reporting symptoms of severe psychopathology, and we also see infrequent somatic responses, kind of the same thing except around somatic problems. This brings us to the symptom validity scale. This is the old fake bad scale. That's what it used to be called. This is when somebody's feigning symptoms. So we see non-credible somatic and neurocognitive complaints. In theory, this is sensitive to exaggerated emotional distress in personal injury settings. We also see a response bias scale, which is another over-reporting scale, the uncommon virtues scale, which is when somebody is lying, and the adjustment validity scale, which is for underreporting. So if somebody has symptoms and they're trying to make it look like they don't have symptoms. So this brings me to the substantive scales. There are a lot of these and a lot of examples with each one. So I'm just going to go through the names of the major categories and give one or two examples from each one. So we see higher order. So an example would be thought dysfunction, restructured clinical. This could be cynicism, antisocial behavior, for example. We see somatic cognitive, so head pain complaints, gastrointestinal complaints, internalizing, like anxiety and anger proneness, externalizing, like aggression and substance use. We see interpersonal, so items like shyness and family problems. Interest, now interest only has two categories, aesthetic, literary, or mechanical, physical interest. And then we see personality, psychopathology 5. So elements like introversion and neuroticism. So as we can see, the MMPI is ambitious. It covers a lot of ground. And even though it takes a while to administer, it seems pretty clear why so many clinicians view the instrument as valuable. So who can administer this test? I mentioned before this requires a level C qualification. Well, if somebody has a doctorate in mental health or education and some other related fields would also qualify, that would be level C. Or they have a license, like a licensed professional counselor, that would qualify. Or they have a full membership in a professional organization and they have access to assessment resources through that membership. So as you can see, some people could probably administer this instrument who maybe shouldn't be administering it because the requirements say or between them, not and. But in my experience, the vast majority of clinicians who use the instrument meet all of the qualifications, even though, again, they'd only need to meet one of those technically. So what is the instrument used for? What makes the MMPI so controversial is its use in both clinical and non-clinical settings. Most people understand that psychometric instruments are used in clinical settings, like where people would be expected to have mental disorders. If somebody comes to a mental health agency and they have concerns about mental health symptoms, again, they're not surprised by a psychometric instrument. The counselor gives them a test, and it helps the counselor figure out what's going on diagnostically. But why would somebody in the non-clinical population need a psychometric test like the MMPI? There are actually a number of settings where we see the MMPI being used non-clinically. A few of the popular ones, custody proceedings. So at some point, kind of determining who is fit to care for a child might be what somebody's looking at there on the MMPI. Personal injury cases to see if somebody is faking illness or exaggerating symptoms. We see the MMPI used in prison. And in prison, over-reporting is fairly popular, especially symptoms that involve hallucinations and delusions, because sometimes prisoners are trying to obtain psychotropic medications. But we also see underreporting happens in prison, especially in a pre-release assessment. So somebody's getting ready to be freed from prison, and they want to appear like they do not have psychopathology. Another popular use is when trying to hire for high-risk public safety positions, like police, firefighters, pilots, air traffic controllers, and nuclear power plant personnel. It can only be administered after a job offer. The job offer is contingent upon passing the mental health and personality assessment, and part of that assessment could include the MMPI. The next question is the MMPI unbeatable? While any test can be defeated, the question really becomes about how difficult it is to defeat it, and is it legal or ethical to do so? So looking at the difficulty part, the MMPI is difficult to defeat. It has a substantial number of items, and it has robust and high-quality validity scales. It simply doesn't seem worth the effort that it would take to defeat the test, especially considering that the test is combined with other instruments and interviews in order to make a decision. In terms of the final decision that's made using an MMPI, the weight given to the MMPI results might be less than 10%. Again, interviews and other instruments would be included in that as well. Also, we have to consider what direction we're talking about. So when somebody says, is the MMPI unbeatable or can it be beaten? Are we talking about someone who has a mental disorder who's trying to cover it up? Or are we talking about someone who does not and they want to appear to be disordered? We sometimes see the first scenario in terms of people applying for high-risk public safety positions. I talked about that before. When considering what's at stake when hiring for these positions, I would hope that nobody would try to beat the test. The best strategy is to always tell the truth. Some people may find out from an assessment, which again could include the MMPI, that they really aren't suited for certain types of jobs. And that's a win for everybody. It keeps the public safe, and it allows that person to find a career that makes sense for them. In terms of trying to beat the test in the other direction, so we have somebody who's trying to appear like they have a disorder when they don't, this also runs into legal and ethical problems. When somebody is trying to say that they have symptoms or to exaggerate symptoms due to external incentives, this is referred to as malingering. And in many situations, malingering is a crime. So what are my criticisms of the MMPI? So I have a few, but I also have criticisms about how it's used, right? So not necessarily about the test all the time, but how people apply the test. So the first criticism, some places try to use the MMPI, an instrument based on the MMPI, or another instrument based on the same theory, when the instrument is not appropriate for the task. I can understand concerns around high-risk public safety positions and forensic settings, but I wonder if this instrument is always well suited to custody proceedings and personal injury litigation. I'm aware the research supports that this instrument is valid in terms of findings in these settings. It's really about whether it's the right thing to do or not. Using the MMPI can lead to a risk of discriminating based on personality and mental disorders. Now, an example of discrimination, we see that there was this lawsuit in the early 90s against the retailer Target that eventually settled. Target contracted with mental health clinicians to test their security personnel using a variant of the MMPI called the Rogers Condensed CPI MMPI. This instrument really wasn't well suited for the purpose, and it contained items that asked personal and intrusive questions. Now moving to my second criticism of the MMPI, sometimes we see that the results of this test are ignored when they should not have been ignored. For example, the MMPI results for the police officer who murdered Justine Damond in 2017 in Minnesota indicated that he should have never been a police officer. Yet several people ignored that evidence. The clinicians warned them, and they didn't listen. This was a situation where maybe the public felt safe because they thought, okay, police officers are screened using this instrument and other means. But again, if the hiring authorities aren't going to listen to the clinicians, they're not even going to consider their advice, that's problematic. My third criticism, once in a while we see that clinicians share information from the MMPI with the hiring authorities instead of just sharing their opinion. So the hiring authorities are really paying for an expert opinion, not for specific answers to items on the tests and not for what the exact scale scores are. I realize that for many clinicians it's tempting because the hiring authority is paying the clinician for the assessment, and these are relatively expensive assessments. So the clinicians don't want to lose that customer. So again, sometimes they reveal more information than they're allowed to. My fourth criticism, clinicians often ignore invalid test results and still interpret these substantive scales. So what I mean here is that if the validity scales indicate that the test is not valid, that ends the interpretation. That's it. You're not supposed to go any further and examine those scales because, again, they're invalid, right? So that's what validity scales are for. So the substantive scale should be ignored at that point. But what happens again is this is an expensive assessment, and some clinicians can't resist the temptation to force some sort of utility out of the instrument, right? To get the money's worth out of the administration instead of just tossing all the results. And that brings me to my fifth criticism, which is my last criticism of the MMPI, and probably the most important one. This involves the validity of the legendary fake bad scale, which of course is now renamed the symptom validity scale. Now, this can be used on both the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-2-RF. I mentioned there's a lot of controversy about this. Essentially, if one believes that the fake bad scale is valid, then to some extent, they believe that the MMPI can be used as a lie detector, at least for a specific type of lie, namely somebody claiming to have mental or physical symptoms that they don't have. There are a few problems here. This lie doesn't always point to malingering. For example, it could also point toward factitious disorder. Another problem, malingering doesn't mean that somebody is free of psychopathology. Somebody can be malingering and still have a mental disorder. I've seen many clinicians who view malingering and psychopathology as mutually exclusive, but of course they're not. Research findings are mixed in terms of the utility and validity of the fake bad scale. It's not really clear if the scale works well or not, but we know that some researchers believe that the risk of a false positive is too high, and some researchers believe that the scale is nonsense in its entirety. Moving back to that false positive point, this one's really important. This means that somebody is accused of malingering when they are not malingering. And we see some horror stories related to this. One such story is contained in one of the articles I used for this video. I'll put all the references to the articles I used in the description for this video. Now, in this article, we see that there's a description of a client who had bulimia nervosa and was assessed in an inpatient environment. She had a valid MMPI profile except for a high score on the fake bad scale. Because of this score, the treatment team put the client back into reassessment, which meant that she was not treated for 2 days, right? Not given the correct treatment anyway for her disorder. Also, the insurance company would not pay for inpatient care, right? They looked at the results that were presented by the clinician and said, well, if this client is faking bad, we're not going to pay. So the client's husband paid out of pocket because he knew the disorder was real. Eventually, the treatment team realized that this client really did have the disorder she claimed to have, and they asked for an expert consultation. The expert looked at it and overturned the decision, right? He knew that the fake bad scale was not to be trusted. The client received the treatment that she should have received in the first place. Not only did the insurance cover the entire stay, but the agency extended the stay for 3 days free of charge. Fortunately, the expert realized that the clinician doing the original assessment over-relied on the fake bad scale. He trusted that scale when he should not have. But how many times has something like this happened where no expert was called in? Nobody was there to reverse the incorrect decision. So that's kind of scary. Examples like that really make me cautious about the fake bad scale. In my opinion, this scale is not valid enough for use in clinical or non-clinical settings. But that doesn't mean that the entire MMPI should be discarded. Overall, it's actually an incredible instrument in terms of its complexity and what it can reveal about psychopathology and personality. Even still, the results of the MMPI should never be used in isolation. Clinical judgment is a clinician's best tool.
For more content like this, check out Healthy Toxic, another podcast from Ars Longa Media, all about what makes or breaks relationships, including issues related to narcissism, narcissistic abuse, and how personality disorders affect relationships. Ars Longa Vita Brevis. Learn more at arslonga.media.